One.
Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for Standard 10.4.1, the causes and consequences of new imperialism. The essential question is, what are the causes and consequences of new imperialism? Next slide. There's our bubble map. We're going to start with a discussion of what imperialism is, then we're going to talk about the causes and consequences of it. Next slide. First heading is imperialism. Conquest is as old as civilization itself, probably older, going back to ancient times, maybe even prehistoric times. Next slide. Beginning around 1850, European nations and the United States took control of much of Africa and Asia. And here's a map of the world showing who controlled what during that period of time. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. Here's a definition of imperialism. Imperialism occurs when one country conquers another country or region. That's basically what imperialism is. And here's a political cartoon showing imperialism. Next slide. Imperialism of this period, that is the late 1800s, early 1900s, went hand in hand with industrialization. So there's really a connection between the rise of new imperialism and the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. Imperialist nations sought cheap raw materials and new markets for their industrial economies. Economics was a primary motive of, and still is, of imperialism. Next slide. Imperialist nations used new forms of transportation and weaponry to seize foreign lands. And here's a primitive machine gun that allowed Europeans to do a lot of conquering in the period we're discussing. Next slide. Imperial leaders often justified their actions using a concept called social Darwinism. And this is supposed to be kind of a funny cartoon with the face of Charles Darwin on an ape. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide. Social Darwinism is the application of Darwin's ideas about, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote, to human society. Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution stated that only those species of animals that are strong survive, and many began to apply his theories to international relations and the fact that strong nations will conquer weaker ones. Next slide. This is the idea that in nature, the strong will survive and the weak will not. And social Darwinism applies that to nations. Next slide. Social Darwinists believe that wealth, technology, and success and strength make some groups superior to others. Next slide. Social Darwinism sought to give Europeans and Americans the right to invade some non-European lands. So just like in the animal kingdom, the lion has the right, because of who it is, to hunt. That same idea was applied to human beings and human societies, and strong countries somehow had the right to conquer weaker ones, non-European ones especially. Next slide. This mindset was used to justify Europe's and America's imperialist goals. Next slide. And there's a video. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Causes of Imperialism. Nationalism was one of the most powerful motivating factors behind new imperialism. This idea that the more territory you control, the more powerful your nation is. Next slide. Powerful nations sought to gain more power by competing for colonies and control of trade routes, as is shown here. Next slide. Another motivating factor behind the rise of imperialism was economic competition, which we've already mentioned. Industrial demand for natural resources and new markets created a race for new colonies. Next slide. Another motivating factor was racism. A widespread belief in the late 1800s held that white Europeans and Americans were a superior race. Next slide. Imperialists of this period claimed they had a right to conquer land inhabited by non-European people. Next slide. The missionary impulse was another motivating force behind new imperialism. Next slide. Christian missionaries believed that they would do good spreading Christian teachings throughout the globe. Next slide. The last heading is the effects of imperialism. Europeans and Americans of this period used their wealth and other advantages to conquer foreign lands. Next slide. Europeans also influenced the economies, politics, and social lives of the native peoples they conquered. For example, they brought technologies like railroads to conquered territories. Next slide. Colonization was another effect of imperialism. Colonization is when Europeans or Americans moved and lived in the areas that they conquered. Next slide. A colony included transplanted settlers living overseas, like this picture shows. Next slide. In this period, Europeans and Americans colonized much of Africa and Asia. These were the two continents that were really the target of imperialism, Africa and Asia, along with Australia too. Next slide. Another effect of imperialism was the control of colonial economies. Next slide. Imperial nations set up colonial economies that were dependent on the, quote, mother country. So the mother country, as shown in this cartoon, like Britain, would get natural resources and raw materials from their colonies. Let's say India, for example. Next slide. Imperial nation discouraged colonies from developing their own industries. And this visual here shows a native going off to work and the European kind of kicking back and living off the work of the native. This is a kind of an overview or an interpretation of what imperialism was really like, kind of a metaphor here. Next slide. The exporting of raw materials was the top priority for imperialist nations, and this visual shows a tea plantation. Tea was one of the many things that the British got from their overseas colonies. Next slide. Another effect of imperialism, as we discussed earlier, was the spread of Christianity to large parts of the world, especially Africa and Asia. Next slide. Imperialism of this period had a major impact on the course of world history. And that's it for this section. Next slide.